Hi everyone, this is going to be a video walkthrough for question 1 on CS61B, Spring 2017, Midterm 1. Okay, so for this question, it's going to be testing our understanding of pass-by value. And I'll delve into a little more depth of pass-by value as we go into the problem. Okay, so let's first read the prompt. Assume we run the main method. In the blanks next to each print statement, write the result of the statement. If the print statement executes multiple times, use multiple blanks. Okay, so all it's really saying is that we're running the code in the main method below, right? We're running this code right here. And every time something is printed, we put it in the blank, right? And if print statements get called multiple times, we move to the next blank. That's all it's really saying. Okay, let's dive in. We see here that when we start running the main method, the first thing that we do is we create two variables, x1 and y1. Okay, so I'm going to say in my main method, in the scope of the main method, we see that we have x1 and y1. Okay, with values 42 and 12 respectively. Then what we do is we call the swap function, okay, with x1 and y1. Okay, so now let's dive into how pass-by value really works. When we set x equal to x1, what we're doing is we're passing the value of x1 and we're setting that as the new value of x. That's what pass-by value means. Okay, so we see here that x1 has a value of 42. Okay, so when we set the x in the swap function to equal x1, what we're doing is we're setting the value of x to be 42. Okay, and in the same light, we set the value of y to be y1, which is 12. So we can note in the scope of the swap function, we see that x has value 42 and y has value 12, right? Because we copied the values of x1 and y1. Nice. Okay, so the next thing that we're doing here is that we perform a swap. Okay, so all that's doing is swaps x and y. Except what's very important to note is that in the main function, the variables x1 and y1 have not changed, right? We're only changing the variables x and y in the scope of the swap function. So when we print out x here, we see that x has indeed swapped, but when we move down here, we see that x1 and y1 have stayed the same, right? So we could print out 42 and 12 respectively. Nice. So moving on to the next part, now it gets a bit trickier. Instead of working with integers, now we're going to be working with arrays. So we create two arrays, x2 and y2, and then we call the swap function on these arrays. Okay, so when we execute pass-by value with numbers, we just set one number or one variable equal to the number that's passed in, right? So how does it work with arrays? When we set the x in the scope of this different swap function to equal x2, what we're doing is we're setting x to be the value of x2. But what is the value of x2 if x2 is an array? So when I think about x2, how I like to think about it is that the value of x2 is an address of where the array lives in memory. Okay, so the value of x2 is some address where the array 1, 2, 3 lives in memory. Okay, so now when we look in the scope of this new swap function, and we're figuring out like what's the value of x, well, in Java, we execute pass by value. So what that's really doing is it's saying that the value of x is the value of x2, and the value of x2 is this address. So what we can say is that the value of x is also that address, right? Cool. So in the same light, we have y2, which is some address. More specifically, it's the address of where 456 is. And then we have here that y is also that address. Okay? And then what we do in the scope of this swap function is we swap these addresses. Okay? So what we're doing here is now x and y swap, right? So x value is y's address, and y's value is x's address, right? That's what this swap is doing right here. And then what we do is we print out x of 0. So what is x? X is this array. So x of 0 is going to be 4. But what's very important to note, similar to the last part, is after swapping x and y in the scope of this function, we haven't changed x2 and y2 in the scope of the main function, right? So what happens here is that x2, 0 and y2, 0 are unchanged. So we put 1 and 4, respectively. Cool, we're almost there. So for this last part, it's actually not as tricky as it looks. What's happening here is that we create these two arrays, x2 and y2, and then we call swap of x2, 0 and y2, 0. Okay? So what's happening here is that in the swap function, recall that we're setting x and y to be equal to x2, 0 and y2, 0, right? So what is the value of x2 indexed 0? That is the element 1. So all x is, it's going to be equal to the value 1, because the value of x2 indexed at 0 is 1, right? In the same regard, we see that y will be equal to 4, right? And now what we notice is that this is going to execute exactly the same as how this first part executed, right? These two will execute exactly the same, because all that we're doing is we're calling the swap method with two numbers, right? It doesn't really matter that these numbers came from an array, because all that we're doing is we're passing in these numbers to the swap method. It had no idea that x2 index 0, or the value 1, actually came from an array, okay? So what's important here is that when we call the swap method the second time around, right, we have the values 1 and 4, then we swap them, and then we see that x becomes 4 when it's printed. Okay? Then what we notice is that down here, x2, 0 and y2, 0 have not changed, so we print out 1 and 4 again. Okay, that is all for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and good luck with the rest of the exam.